S C E.
It's so hard. It's so hard. It's so hard. It's so hard. It hurts so bad when hearts are parted. Oh, heaven knows. Oh, no. Oh, heaven knows. Oh, no. To guard it. It's so hard. It's so hard. It's so hard. It's so hard. It hurts so bad when hearts are parted. Oh, heaven knows. Oh, heaven knows. I tried to guard it. I tried harder each day. I sacrificed for it for pain. Ladies, 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 ladies.
S C E.
With the story to tell. And when I rock the crowd, I rock the crowd well. But when I get the feeling, I feel the feel swell. Cause when I start to rhyme, I rhyme the rhyme well. Cause I'm a craftsman who ain't fasting. To get attacked, every one of y'all draftsmen. I'm rehashing, it ain't masking. Bringing the beat back and keeping it lasting. Lasting, lasting. a beauty, very special, really and truly. Got somebody, she is a beauty, very special, really and truly.
S C E.
It's so hard. It's so hard. It's so hard. It's so hard. It hurts so bad when hearts are parted. Oh, heaven knows. Oh, no. Oh, heaven knows. Oh, I tried to guard it. It's so hard. It's so hard. It's so hard. It's so hard. It hurts so bad when hearts are parted. Oh, heaven knows. Oh, heaven knows. I tried to guard it. I tried harder each day. I sacrificed, but it won't pay. Ladies, ladies, ladies.
S C E.
MCA with a story to tell. And when I rock the crowd, I rock the crowd well. But when I get the feeling, I feel the feel swell. Cause when I start to rhyme, the rhyme well. Cause I'm a craftsman who ain't fasting. Took it to task. Every one of y'all tasking. I'm rehashing and ain't masking. Bringing the beat back and keeping it lasting.
I forget, there will be a free will donation. Walls' re-election campaign. All right, that didn't land, I don't think. So anyway, welcome. Again, we've got an exciting docket today. Jody is going to kick us off. Jody Schwann's going to kick us off, do a state of the city, if you will. She's just put out her CEO panel survey about 10 days ago, and so we're going to see the latest results on that. Dr. Santos is going to do more of a macro look, talk about some Fed policy and some monetary policy, and when is the CARES Act money going to come out, and a bunch of other topics. And then we've got an exciting panel at the end, some real business owners in this region that are going to give you some takeaways to take off. So without further ado, the lady who needs no introduction, the founder of Sioux Falls.Business, please help me in welcoming Jody Schwan.
Thanks, Reggie. Thanks for having me back, everyone. I really enjoy this event. I think it's my third year helping host it, so I must be getting you out of here on time. And that's my goal today as well as hopefully delivering a really interesting program. So we actually are going to begin with Joe Santos, who's going to begin with the overview of the South Dakota economy for us. A quick reminder for you of who Joe Santos is. He's the professor and Dyke House Scholar in Money, Banking, and Regulation in the Ness School of Management and Economics at South Dakota State University. And there he coordinates the Ness School's graduate programs. Santos also teaches macroeconomics and monetary and financial economics. Areas of his research include financial regulation and monetary policy. And I did not know this, but Joe is the voice of Monday Macro, which airs on select Mondays on South Dakota Public Radio's In the Moment with Lori Walsh. A great program, so I'll have to listen for him on that. Santos earned his MA and his PhD in economics from Rutgers University. So please help me welcome Joe Santos.
Well, good afternoon. Can everyone hear me okay? We're good? Good. All right. We have the slide deck up. All right. So, thank you for this opportunity. My job here today, as I understand it, is to talk a little bit about the macroeconomy that we are now operating in, some of the perhaps pain points within that macroeconomy, and what we should think about in the context of macroeconomic policy going forward. So let me dive right in. As I like to say, macroeconomics is for the birds. And what I mean by this is that when we think about the general features of the economy, the tendency is to look down from 50,000 feet and essentially see two features. We see general economic activity typically measured by something like real gross domestic product, think output, and we see inflation, right? And so when we talk about the birds in macroeconomics, I'm thinking of doves and hawks. And essentially, doves are folks who, when they look at this trade-off between output and inflation, think output should be our primary concern. And along with that, employment and other sort of real features of the economy. And of course, hawks look down from 50,000 feet, and they think instead about inflation. And they think that that's the primary feature of the economy and that a free enterprise economy cannot function effectively without a stable purchasing power of money. And so we're always dealing with this macroeconomic trade-off. Which of these do we care most about? So before we get going any further, and I encourage you to participate through this entire event, and I will stop soon enough to allow Q&A as well, I'm just curious. Any self-described doves? Self-described, we got a dove. Hawks? All right, quite a bit of hawks. And by the way, you can switch back and forth throughout the program, throughout life. Okay, so let me start by actually showing you some of these features. So I'm just going to dive in to level the base. What has output looked like for the U.S. economy? And likewise, what has the purchasing power of money, inflation, look like for the U.S. economy? So there it is. That's output. I'm showing you a data set going back to include the Great Recession so that you have some sense of comparison between the two events, the Great Recession and the event most recently that attended the pandemic. And what you see there is that generally speaking, during a business cycle of this sort, we see real gross domestic product fall. And during the pandemic, we saw it fall rather dramatically and then recover rather dramatically as well. So we'll come back to some analysis, but just to level the base, that's what we're dealing with on the side of output. So the doves in the room might be most concerned about that figure. And then we could look at inflation. And here I'm using the Federal Reserve's preferred measure, which is a personal consumption expenditures index, but this is the one that Jay Powell is always encouraging us to watch. And what you can see here is unambiguous. Inflation has been rising. And this is a year-over-year measure, so as I know many of you know and read about often, there's some base effect here because a year ago inflation was quite timid, but nevertheless, there are price pressures in the economy. Okay, so that's what we're dealing with right now from 50,000 feet. So now what I want to do is go into 5 takeaways. And the first one is what I like to call mind the gaps. And here what I'm thinking about is not just looking at output or employment or inflation, but thinking about these measures in relationship to what we think they should be if the economy were operating at full capacity. That second little bit is a bit of a counterfactual, more art than science, but we have our ways of trying to come up with this as macroeconomists. So let me show you what I mean. So in the case of output first, and then we'll just go employment and inflation. This is the output gap. So what you're looking at for any one of these bars, think the vertical distance. If it's negative, think the economy is underperforming relative to some measure of potential output. And I want to emphasize the fact that prior to this pandemic, we had been in historically long expansion. And so when you pretty much don't see any bars, that means they're aligned with 0, which is to say we're at full employment. And then, of course, everything changed very quickly. And now what you have is a situation where the output gap is shrinking. And if you look at that last bar, sort of turn left and go across, you'll see it's something like 3-ish%. So how do you use that in a sentence? $20 trillion US economy, 3% is about what we're missing in terms of full employment. Hundreds of billions, but not hundreds of trillions or trillions of dollars. Hundreds of billions is the order of magnitude there of how much we're down, and it's shrinking at the moment. The employment gap, here I'm doing a little bit of my own art versus science to come up with what I'm thinking about in terms of the counterfactual, where would we be had the pandemic not happened. And here what I'm doing is I'm just looking at the level of employment in the United States economy in February 2020 and then measuring every other month's number against that. And so when you look at the last bar, what you notice is a lineup of about 3-4% gap on about 150 million people, so 4 or 5 million people still represent the gap. That is to say, where we were in February 2020 versus where we are now, we're down by a couple million. This is not unemployment. This is employment, just the gross number of those persons, as the Bureau of Labor Statistics identifies them, who are, if you will, missing relative to February 2020. So there is an employment gap. And there's one for South Dakota as well, though it has been shrinking dramatically. So that last data point is South Dakota's. That would number in the few thousands of individuals or persons who are, again, if you will, loosely speaking, missing relative to February 2020. So the output gap is negative. The employment gap, as I represent it, is negative. The inflation gap's a little positive. So what is this? That is not the inflation rate. That is the gap. So I've taken the inflation rate and I subtracted 2%. Not very difficult arithmetic, but 2% is the Federal Reserve's preferred target range. So that number there is about 1.5%, the length of that bar in that positive space. That is to say, inflation, as the Federal Reserve measures it, is coming in at about 1.5% in excess of what they would prefer, which is 2%. So the output gap is very much positive, right, as we recorded according to this measure. Okay. So I want to focus a little more on employment, since it seems that everybody is focusing a little more on employment. So let me just dive down a bit more into employment and focus on something I like to call a peculiar beverage. Beveridge refers to William Beveridge, 20th century parliamentarian and sometimes political economist in Britain, who made famous a relationship that we should expect to see between the unemployment rate in an economy and the job vacancy rate in that economy. So let me show you a Beveridge curve with actual data. This is for the United States. From 1990, every dot is a month. From 1990 to 2020 February, right before the pandemic. And what you notice is this rather seemingly systematic relationship. So for example, let me identify some dots and you'll see immediately what we're looking at. So that red dot down there, that's the 10% at the start of the financial crisis. You have a very high unemployment rate on the horizontal axis, but you have a very low job vacancy rate, as you would imagine in a recessed economy. And then the economy proceeds through time, through that decade after the financial crisis, and we hit November 2014. I just picked a dot, right? But the point is, at this point, your unemployment rate is coming down from that high, and the job vacancy rates are rising as demand is rising as we exit that recession. And then finally, right before the pandemic, we end up at this very low unemployment rate and a very high job vacancy rate, right? Just what we would expect, just what Beveridge told us that we should expect. Okay, I added the red fitted line just to find a sort of a central tendency, and it's very well behaved, as you can see. All right, now let's click again and let's add the points since February 2020, and you get something very bizarre. What we would call a shift of the Beveridge curve. And that's a thing. There's like a paragraph in textbooks about what to expect when that happens. And what it signals is an inefficiency in the job search process. So think of it, I don't know, I look down at the horizontal axis and think for any given unemployment rate, look up, turn left, you have a higher job vacancy rate than you would otherwise. So there's something about search and matching in the labor market that has become very inefficient. And again, let's walk through some dots. That's April 2020. The unemployment rate shot up to 14.7%. At first, this was a demand shock. Everyone stayed home in lockdown. Job vacancies collapsed. And then, of course, we find ourselves in the current situation where the unemployment rate has actually come down quite a bit. Job vacancies are enormously high. And the matching process is, let's just say, inefficient. And so we have lots of help wanted signs, and we're not able to fill those positions in the way we might expect. And I'll sort of be brief about some of this, but there are broader narratives we can talk about, and I'll know you're interested because you'll ask me a question about it. But there are reasons why Beveridge curves shift out from the origin like this. And again, for now, the takeaway tends to be it's a matter of search of inefficiencies, right? So that's happening. There's also something else I think that particularly a Chamber of Commerce audience might be interested in, and that is the way that I like to call it gender participation is playing out during this period versus other recessions. And, you know, this one was brief, but nevertheless, we can monitor this. And that is to say, what has happened to the employment to population ratio during this recession and the past recession? Again, just using 2008 as a basis for comparison. So this is employment to population. You can think of it loosely as a labor force participation rate. But the labor force participation rate is problematic because people can enter and exit the labor force. Exiting the population is a slightly more gruesome affair, right? So there's not a lot of re-entry. And so this is a bit more robust a measure. And what you see here is that the male participation rate, if you will, is higher than the female participation rate, and that's always been the case. And that both of these participation rates drop during recessions. There are dropouts, if you will. What I want to do now is take a look at this second order effect, take a look at the slopes, if you will, and I'm going to take 2008 as an example and look at how precipitously the blue line is falling as we enter that recession versus how precipitously the sort of light purple line is falling, to get a sense of how this participation dropout, if you will, is affecting genders. And so this is what you get. So how do you read this? Well, take a look at the very last data points, if you will. That's saying that for men, there's about a 5% drop in participation, yes, 5%. And for female, it's about, looks like 97.5. So there's about 2.5% larger dropout rate for men than women at that point. That's typical of all recessions. Let me show you that now. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to calculate just that difference for 10 different recessions going back to 1960. So don't look at the lines, look at the legend. The legend is showing you the peak of each one of those business cycles. So April 1960 was the best day, and then the economy contracted from there and so on. And for example, let me put up the financial crisis recession. It's right there. So what is that? You're above zero, meaning that the male dropout rate is greater than the female dropout rate, right? And if you look at all those lines, they all sort of tend to go up away from the axis. That is, the dropout rate for men tends to exceed the dropout rate for women. And if you really want to connect the dots to my 2.5% number a moment ago, that's the last data point on the black line, right? So now let's click this and let's see what this path looks like for the current recession. Like nothing we've ever seen since the 1960s. What are we looking at? That is how much the female dropout rate exceeds the male dropout rate in this in this recession. So again, going back to 1960, I did the same thing 10 or 9 times, and I only found this pattern once. Clearly, this has something to do perhaps directly with the pandemic, but that affects both genders. I suspect this has something more to do with conventions and social norms around care for the elderly and care for the young, and perhaps the absence of a sort of structural system to alleviate these sorts of pressures. And so what individuals or households are doing are what we call in macroeconomics self-insuring. They're doing it themselves. And so you don't have the economies of scale you might have otherwise. And so these folks have no choice but to leave the employment. So again, I think that's something worth thinking about as we work through our employment pain point right now, is how this is affecting households. And this is one way. One other little bit is, of course, with all of this sort of pain in the employment market, you would expect that there are probably wage effects, and there are. So here I'm thinking of bargaining power in terms of what this is doing to the wage. And so what I have here are 2 measures of the wage, and both are interesting, but not for the same reasons. So average hourly earnings, that's the dotted line that spikes dramatically. That's just what it says. It's average hourly earnings. So what happens during the pandemic is we don't see a bunch of wage increases. We see individuals who earn the least dropping out of employment. And so it's like dropping all your D's and F's. Your GPA skyrockets, right? It's the same mathematics involved here. So that's average hourly earnings. It's interesting in that it gives us a sense of how that labor market churned during the pandemic. It's not interesting in giving us a sense of what employment costs have done. For that, we look at the employment cost index. And there we do see some pressure. So the employment cost index adjusts for this phenomenon of folks exiting employment in disproportionate ways depending on their industry. It controls for that. And so there you see you have employment growth. This is quarterly data. Most recent data point is a little north of 3.5%. Right? And I suspect this will continue to rise. So there are wage pressures. What's interesting, perhaps just for the microeconomics nerds in the room, is that if you take that last data point and you disaggregate it for industry, you get this. So for example, the financial services industry has the smallest employment gap at the moment, horizontal axis. And the financial industry, the bright red dot, has the least wage pressure, just what you would expect. And then you go over here and you notice an enormous employment gap remains, and that's where we see the greatest wage pressure. Anyone? Industry? Which one? Was that? Yeah, leisure hospitality. That's right, that's leisure hospitality. So I added the red fitted line because I'm a micro geek, but I thought that was kind of cool, right? That we actually see the sort of pressure we would expect from the employment gaps that we observe, right? It sort of aligns with the industry employment gaps. Okay, number 2, second takeaway, mix a proper cocktail. Here I'm referring to the policy mix, right, as we call it. I have no data to share here. I have a little bit of an analysis I want you to work with me through just a simple diagram or 2 to try to understand from a macroeconomic policymaker's perspective, just to try to understand what they are dealing with, what the challenge has been, and perhaps why they have approached it the way they have. I'm not an apologist for those policymakers, but I want you to understand the tension that this pandemic has introduced to policymaking. So what does the proper mix look like? What does the proper cocktail look like? I'm thinking here of monetary and fiscal policy. And monetary policy, of course, is adjusting interest rates and the money supply to bring about macroeconomic outcomes. And the instruments for fiscal policy, of course, are very different. Here we're talking about taxes and transfers and government expenditures. 2 very different sets of tools, each with the same objective, some hawk-dove combination of output and price stability, right? Both of them, and this is important, affect aggregate demand. Think total demand in the economy. There's such a thing called aggregate demand, and there's such a thing called aggregate supply. Supply reflects the capacity in the economy, how we turn inputs to outputs, the ingredients we have available, and the recipes we use to produce what we produce with those ingredients. Monetary policy and fiscal policy, macroeconomic policy in general, has nothing to say about the aggregate supply curve. It never does. It can't unload ships more quickly in the port of San Diego. It cannot fix transportation bottlenecks. You saw the instruments I showed you, interest rate, money supply, tax transfers, government expenditures. None of them dislodge a ship from the Suez Canal. Right? So it's all about aggregate demand. So here's the situation. We've got demands downward sloping, supplies upward sloping. You know the routine. We have GDP on the horizontal axis, and we have inflation on the vertical axis. And all a macroeconomic policy maker can do, if she chooses to do anything at all, is to move the aggregate demand curve around. That's all you got. Right? That's all you got. So now what happens during the pandemic? Well, these policymakers are confronted with that. Supply chain problems, bottlenecks, we've heard all the stories. And so essentially the aggregate supply, the production capacity of the economy, is less than it was before. So now you got to choose. If you sit here, you've got inflation, and the hawks are annoyed, and you've got less output, and the doves aren't happy either. You could leave from this position if you want. You can control aggregate demand. If the hawks have their way, you can shift aggregate demand to the left and ease the price pressure. Kind of like saying, if you don't like that used car prices are expensive, just make people poor enough so they don't bid the price of the car up. Little cynicism, but you get the idea, right? Or the doves can sort of take over and say, no, you got to use aggregate demand to do something about this, and so you do that. And so that's what's happened. That's it, right? But I want to just make it clear that from the policymaker's perspective, you have one tool and two targets. And when you're confronted with a supply shock, you cannot hit both targets simultaneously. So either you have to suffer inflation or you have to keep the economy in a recessed state. No judgment, but macroeconomic policymakers chose to ease the output effects and employment effects. They didn't fix the supply chain problems, but they got used car prices high enough so that used cars started to come to market, right? If we want to use that same sort of back-of-the-envelope intuition. So that's what happened. And so sure enough now, we're going to see some of these effects. I'm going to go through monetary and go through macro with fiscal, with two more takeaways, and then a final one. So follow the money. This is the monetary policy approach. So what happened here? Well, in order to shift the aggregate demand curve, monetary policymakers used what monetary policymakers have, and that was essentially the money supply. And so what you have, I'm going to show you the money supply, and I'm going to show you something really arcane, but very close to my heart, called velocity of money. So, inflation, as Friedman used to say, is everywhere and always a monetary phenomenon, so we look to the money supply, and here what I have is M1 and M2. M1 is currency plus checking accounts. M2 is that plus savings accounts. Or as I always tell my students, you're looking at quantities of what you could go into Jimmy John's with and buy lunch, right? The money supply. And what you notice is a rather severe increase in M1, though that's not as interesting. That's a compositional effect. Money moving from savings accounts to checking accounts. Topic for another day. But the blue line is a net increase in the money supply. So there has been a rather steep incline in M2, the quantity of money in circulation. Think, if you will, there's been a downpour, right? Now the question is, does the downpour cause flooding? Think inflation. And that's where I encourage everyone to take a look at velocity. If the ground is porous and it absorbs the rain, you don't get the flood. If the ground is concrete and rejects the rain, you get the flood. The ground is very porous right now. This is the velocity of money. Think the average number of times that money changes hands, in effect, to buy GDP. We are holding, as an economy, large quantities of M2 in relation to our income and our purchasing needs. We're hoarding money. And so if we're hoarding it, it doesn't have to have the inflationary effects that we normally would associate with it. So I would argue, I talked to Reggie. Reggie says, tell us what you think. It's okay if you're wrong. So here we go. I would argue that monetary stimulus is not the primary stimulus behind the inflationary effects. I think it's a combination of stagflation and fiscal stimulus. I'll explain that in a minute. But monetary stimulus looks really scary if you look at the first picture. But actually, again, this is falling, if you will, onto a porous ground. And so we don't see what we would otherwise see as the inflationary effects of this. That picture can change, of course, and suddenly go up. And then, well, that'll be next year's Outlook seminar, right? No, not after this presentation, but whoever's up here. Okay. So What about fiscal policy? Well, my message here, my takeaway is treasure solvency, right? And here, when we talk about fiscal policy, we're talking about something that is both very personal in terms of how it can affect households. It's incredibly more powerful in this regard than monetary policy is, which is like, as we like to say, pushing on a string. Monetary policy is. You can't get anybody to do something at low interest rates, but you often can get them to do something if you cut their taxes, for example. So it's very powerful, very personal at the household level, but it's also complicated because of sort of the scars it leaves in its path. So, first the personal, what I like to think of as fiscal therapy, right? The easiest way to see this is go right to the heart of it and look at personal income. So there's just a bunch of lines going across the screen. But if you look closely, what I did here is I looked at the growth of personal income through all those recessions again. And so what did the growth in personal income do after the economy began to recess? And all those lines are sort of below 1, meaning the growth in personal income never achieved its growth rate that it had achieved during its expansion. And I'll just pick one. Let's go again with the financial crisis. So there's the financial crisis. What's happening? Personal income is falling. Personal income includes transfer payments, which are instruments of fiscal policy. The famous $787 billion, and we used to think that was big expansionary fiscal policy, right? And so it shows itself in the path of personal income, but mostly the growth in personal income falls during the recession. So those are what? 8 of them. Now let's take a look at the same arithmetic, but applied to the path of personal income growth during this pandemic. I have nothing like this to show, right, in any other period of American monetary or fiscal history. This is an enormous injection of fiscal stimulus. What you're looking at is the growth rate of personal income rising to 2 and 3 and 4 times the rate that it was growing at during the peak of the expansion just before, if you will, all went dark. So this is the personal side of fiscal policy. We know that households have now paid down debt. Their budget positions are better. Food insecurity is not what it once was, and all the rest. Poverty rates have come down. They're very, very tactile sort of outcomes associated with fiscal policy. But, oh, one more, if we want to look at it this way, forgive me. If we look at GDP over that period, it does that. And that's what personal income did during the same period. So again, unprecedented for personal income to look like the positive mirror image of GDP. And this is all because of fiscal transfers into these households. Right? The fiscal space is the complicated part. That is the room to maneuver as a fiscal entity. Think Treasury, literally, the fisc, the purse of the sovereign, of government, and the Congress. The room to move is decreased. The fiscal space is decreased as a result of this, because as a result of this, what we see is taxes minus transfers, that's red, fell dramatically. So we collected taxes, but we also sent payments out to households, and what we sent out to households far exceeded what we collected in tax payments. So the red line drops very, very sharply. The blue line, that's government expenditures, and we bought stuff during the pandemic. If you look closely, you see a little peak, but that's not where the action is. Much of the fiscal stimulus was in the form of $1,400 payments and $600 payments and all the rest. And that's that drop. And so, of course, that's the deficit on a quarterly basis, if you look at the difference between those two. And deficits get added to debt. And so if you take a look at the debt, what you notice is we now have a situation where we don't have the fiscal space that we had before the pandemic. That is the debt ratio, if you will, the amount of debt, think Treasury bills, Treasury notes, and Treasury bonds. Add all that up, and it's about equal to the size of the economy. It's about 1 for 1 right now, right? And so this always raises this kind of complicated, wonky question, but I think it's one we should really think about, is this sustainable? I just mean mathematically, arithmetically, is this sustainable? And that has to do with the measure. You have a numerator, which is the existing amount of debt in the economy, and you have a denominator, which is the size of the economy. The numerator grows at the interest rate because the government rolls over its debt, and the denominator grows at the rate of economic growth. And so it's a race between the two as to whether or not you can keep this where it now is. And so let me show you this. I want to show you the interest rate and then show you the growth in the economy and see where they are. If the economy is growing faster than the debt can accumulate interest payments, we're good. Sort of good. So here it is. This is just the interest rate in the economy. This is the Treasury bond rate, smoothed out. It's spikier than that on a day-to-day basis, of course, but I've smoothed it. And so you have a general sense of the tendency of the government's borrowing rates over time, and then the growth rate in the economy. And again here, I'm smoothing it, but this is just the quarterly growth in real GDP. And then I'm just going to drop a curtain down so it's really easy to see. If the blue line is inside the curtain, that means that interest rates are below the growth in the economy. And so if what you're trying to do is stabilize the debt, you can achieve it because the debt grows at an interest rate that is less than the rate at which the economy grows. You can grow your way out of the debt. So that's the good news. The not so good news is if you just take a look at the entire time series, you notice that the circumstances we are experiencing right now are not the norm, right? Most of the time, the blue line is above the red line. Most of the time, interest rates rise above the rate of economic growth, which means most of the times, the debt is growing faster than the economy is growing. If we were to return to a situation like that, we would essentially have no fiscal space. Surpluses would be necessary, but they wouldn't even be sufficient unless they were large enough, right? Deficits would be explosive. You could not do that. Last one. Changed it, Michael. I was thinking the last time we spoke that it should be relaxed. It's transitory. Michael has this undue influence on me, and after talking to him, I realized I should not be so optimistic. So I changed it to brace yourself. Transitory takes time. What we're getting at, of course, is Jay Powell's famous term, and now everybody's famous term, that the inflation is transitory. It's short-lived. I don't know if it is or not, but I'll show you something that indicates transitory has got to be longer-lived than anyone is thinking of when they think of the vernacular transitory. All right, here's some more inflation data that does point to the fact that this may not be as transitory as anyone was thinking. So this is the Consumer Price Index. It's not the index I showed you earlier, but I'm showing you the CPI because everybody knows the CPI. And number two, because we do some fun stuff to the CPI to try to see how transitory stuff is. So that's just the overall CPI, the thing that just rises up like the Loch Ness Monster, right? But we could do two things to it. We could look at the median price pressure. We could look at trimmed CPI. Throw out the outliers for those who say, but that's the used cars. All right, throw them out. And then look at it. And that's when you get those. And what you notice is that both of these sort of modified, trimmed measures that should really show broader breadth of inflation are indeed rising as well. So there are some price pressures among us in this economy. But again, I would encourage everyone to take a look at, number one, the numbers we're talking about. These are not large numbers, the magnitude of the inflation. And all of them are year-over-year measures, so you're comparing the current measure to a base that was extraordinarily low, right? So all of that is working to make all of this look perhaps a little bigger than it really might be. Okay. Just the last bit then about the transitory. This is not a forecast. This is not a projection. This is simply a thought experiment that I just invite you to join me on, okay? And the thought experiment goes like this. That's the Consumer Price Index up to the pandemic. What I do here is I just simply take the trend in the Consumer Price Index, I fit a trend to that, and I extrapolate and add it to the other side. So what is the red line? What question does it answer? What if tomorrow the Consumer Price Index returned to the trend growth that it had achieved before the pandemic? What if? The reason I'm asking this question is just arithmetically, how long would it take to work through the base effects and get back to an inflation rate around 2 or 2.5. So this is it. I'm just going to do it. I'm going to go in and think like an Excel or something, and I'm just going to say, here, take the growth rate year over year over year over year. Forget the blue, red, just power through. Take the growth rate for every quarter, and let's see what happens. And so that's the real data. That's what happens if you take the inflation rate for every one of those blue dots on that line. And then as you continue to push through into the red part of that figure, the counterfactual part, you get that. Which says what? Just arithmetically, if the inflation rate were to return to normal by the end of this conference, you would not hear CPI-based inflation rates returning to 2% until roughly next July, simply because of the arithmetic around the way we calculate an inflation rate from a CPI. So transitory is going to be a lot longer than we're perhaps thinking. It would at least be another year, at least, simply if everything returns to normal by the end of this conference, and I highly doubt that that's the case. And then the last bit I just want to end with on this section of the sort of transitory nature of all this, it's not everything, but it's the financial markets' expectation of the path of inflation going forward. And what is clear from looking at the difference between nominal and real bond yields to maturity and so on, extrapolating what the market must be thinking about inflation, is they're not thinking that it's going to be much more than about 2.4% 5 or 10 years out. And that matters, because the velocity I showed you, all the spending, the hoarding money, all that changes if inflation suddenly jumps. The expectation in the market doesn't mean they're right, but they would act on expectations, and they're only acting on 2.4. So there seems to be a sense that, as Jay Powell likes to say, expectations are anchored at the moment. I think the greatest threat here is if this figure, of all of them, were to suddenly begin to rise, because that changes everything. Now we all start chasing each other around the room, saying, please take my dollar. And when we chase each other around the room and we're all on the same side of the market saying, please take my dollar, the value of the dollar goes down. That's a very big inflationary threat, which is why the central bank is so fixated on expectations. So, mind the gaps, mix the proper cocktail, follow the money, treasure solvency, embrace yourself. Transitory takes time, and all the details underlying it. The gap, negative output, negative employment, positive inflation. The cocktail, weak aggregate supply, strong aggregate demand. Money's up, velocity's down. Debt to GDP is up, but right now the prevailing winds of interest rates and growth are on our side. And finally, inflation is going to be a while. That is, we're going to have it around for a while above the level we're most comfortable with. Okay? So, we've got time for questions. And we've got microphones for questions. So go for it. I can. I'll repeat it. Go ahead. Yep. Yep. It's not. So the remaining gap, let's see if I can get there on the way. The remaining gap in employment. The gap has not closed, which is why I think the fiscal and monetary policy remains so expansionary. That remaining gap, no. Typically what you would see in an expansion is that, let's take the South Dakota case, for example. Where are we? One more. There. You would see that go away. That is, the employment level would grow. Keep in mind, employment tends to have a growth ingredient to it. So to your good question, this gap is actually more problematic than it appears, because remember what I did to get it. I compared where employment is, say, in that month to where it was in 2020 February. In all likelihood, employment would have continued to grow just through population growth and so forth. And I'm not factoring that in as a baseline. So the gap's larger if we compare it to the counterfactual, of where we would be if the growth had continued throughout this period. Yeah. So no, that gap remaining like that is rather persistent and uncharacteristically so. Yep. Yes, sir.
Some of us are old enough to still have our win buttons with
Yes.
inflation now, and that was psychological.
Yep.
If inflation does stick around for a year and there's all this liquidity out there, won't we start spending those dollars? Isn't that fear that it could just take off?
Absolutely. So there is a powder keg out there in the form of that money supply, in the form of that liquidity. Bank reserves are extraordinarily high. Bankers in the room know excess reserves are extraordinarily high. You have the raw material. So to Dana's question, yes, the 1970s were a case of a supply shock. led by monetary accommodation. And there's a lot of debate as to why they accommodated. In part, they may not have realized where potential output was, but nevertheless, they accommodated. They shifted the aggregate demand curve to the right. Expectations became unanchored, and the rest, as we say, is history. It's possible. One of the most powerful forces against that outcome this time around, I would argue, I'm not saying that it will be successful, but is that we today at least have a much more independent Federal Reserve System than we did in that period in the 1970s prior to Volcker. And so prior to Paul Volcker becoming Fed chair, we had a very compliant, sort of passive Federal Reserve. And I think that that sort of passivity really tends to fuel inflation expectations. If you're thinking, look, the folks in charge of the printing press just don't have the guts to do what they have to do, that will fuel expectations. I don't know if Jay Powell and company are sufficiently credible to sort of say what they say and then have us believe that they mean what they say. But it seems as if at the moment the current Federal Reserve has managed to anchor expectations in a way that, you know, McChesney, Martin, and others in that period were never successful at doing, because they demonstrated themselves to be sort of tools, if you will, of the executive branch several periods prior to that inflation. So I hope that's a fundamental difference, but maybe it's a distinction without a difference. Yeah, I'm sorry, you were going. And I'm being told to please go to the mic if you could, because folks out in web space can't hear. Thank you.
You use the phrase dropouts in the recession. Is that, where are they going? Is that liquid? Is that when the recession leaves, do those people come back into the workforce?
Yes. So that I showed the employment to population ratio, and given that mouthful, I called it a dropout when that number went down. And so one of the ways they leave is they may stay in the labor force, but they simply become unemployed, right? But the more troubling way that they leave is if they leave the labor force entirely. So they were employed, they were in the numerator, then they left the numerator. Did they go to unemployed? That statistic doesn't know. Did they go out of the labor force? That statistic doesn't know. In part, that's its beauty. But to your point, a lot of these folks have exited the labor force, and we surmise that many of them have not re-entered the labor force. In other words, when you're in the labor force, you can be employed or unemployed. Either way you're in. You're actively part of the labor force. I think a lot of these folks left and have not come back. And that's incredibly problematic for obvious reasons. That's right. Good question. Thank you. Well, yeah, please.
Yeah, I was just wondering maybe if you could talk a little bit more about inflation. We're seeing, you know, all of our input costs rising, and some of them are commodities, so that over time they maybe could come back down. But things like labor in particular, you know, you can give a raise, but you really can't take it back later, and then energy costs and things like that. So I do have concerns about inflation moving forward, and even the supply chain, I'm being told, is probably at least a year or longer before some of that gets worked out. So just wondering about Fed policy and what, kind of asking you to predict the future, I guess. So.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate the question, and I'm not just saying this. I was thinking about somehow trying to work this in. You know, inflation, what we are referring to is, of course, a growth in the price level, or if you'd like, a growth in wages, the growth of prices in general. But it is a growth effect. So you say the inflation rate is 4%. If wages rise as a one-off level effect, you're right, that tends not to come back. We say they're rigid or sticky. They are notoriously so. The wages only go up. But the real concern for macroeconomic policymakers is whether what we unleash is a growth effect. So they don't just go up once, but then they continue to rise at that rate over time. And to Dana's question, I think what can motivate that sort of thing is expectations of inflation, which then get worked into long-term contracts, which then play out over time as a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. But there really is an important distinction here. A one-off event, used car prices go up by 43%. That's not problematic if used car prices then come back down, or even, this won't happen, but stay there. Let's just for argument's sake. Were they to continue to rise at that rate, that would be a general inflation. So there are inflationary pressures. There is no question about that. But there are also, I think there is a distinction to be made between one-off level effects and sustained growth in any price that you might be thinking of. So if these supply pressures were to ease, we might expect to see the levels remain in place and be persistent, but perhaps we would not expect to see the growth occur again if those supply constraints were to ease. Continuing with your question, if aggregate demand, however, stays as stimulative as it is, that could bring about growth effects, either directly, because we just keep bidding up the prices of goods and services, or back to the point of expectations. We contract for higher prices and higher interest rates and higher rents and so forth, anticipating it. But a one-off effect is not necessarily going to drive inflation, because it, technically speaking, is not inflation. It's a one-off jump in price. We need a persistent growth in the price level. It's not to say it's impossible. It can happen, but it's just something slightly different than a one-off increase. So. What else? No? Going once? All right. Well, thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Great questions. Thank you, Joe. I think Joe will be around the rest of the program too, right? We'll have some more Q&A at the end, so we can always invite him back up. All right, now I get to figure out how the clicker works because I didn't try it before. Big green button. There's two big green buttons. The one with the triangle? Yes. No. How about, can you guys help me out while I introduce this a little bit and get me where I need to be? Okay. So a little background, first of all, on the CEO survey. We presented this to you, I think, the last 2 years in a row, and we started this in partnership with the Augustana Research Institute. It'll be 5 years in March, which was when I launched Sioux Falls Business. And you know, to be honest with you, we were sort of bumping between good and excellent there for a long time, and I was like, well, I mean, I think it's a valuable tool, but I always figured there would come a time when we would see measurable change, and of course that came in the second quarter of 2020. So we had sent this survey out in about mid-March, right as everything was shutting down, and absolutely we saw an extremely prominent change in our numbers when those came back looking ahead at the second quarter of 2020. We started to see a bit of a rebound in the third quarter, and then this time a year ago, when I was here sharing those results, I think we thought things were looking pretty good. I think we thought that by and large our CEO community was feeling certainly more positive than they had been 6 months prior as they looked toward the fourth quarter. So what I'm going to do today is you're the first to get a look at this. We did this survey with our CEO group in the second half of September. And first of all, one key thing that has changed year to year is our sample size. So a year ago, we had about 3 dozen CEOs take that survey. I get it, it was 2020. It was easy to lose track of different things that you had to do. But today we're happy that we've grown that list and we've grown our participation. So we've got about 65 CEOs that weighed in on the results that you're going to see. We would like to grow that list further for a number of reasons. So Marianne is going to help me out and send a sign up around. And company presidents, CEOs, founders, executive directors, if you are not currently on my list to take this, if you could please give me your name, email address, and this is new, a phone number that we can text you on, which I realize is a little scary for both of us. But we have developed a text group of about 300 CEOs that we text very rarely, but it is an easy, convenient way to send you just the link to this survey that you can then complete very quickly on your phone. So if you are comfortable with that, all of this information stays with me. Your survey results are anonymous. I cannot tell whose results are who. And one hopefully added reason for you to help us out with this is that we have just recently had a couple of different organizations reach out with interest in this survey, one of which is the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. I had an advisor to Neil Kashkari reach out to me about a month ago and say, you know, we try to get information from South Dakota businesses and we struggle with that in putting our reports together, and we saw this survey and wondered if you'd be willing to share the results. So I see that as a win-win. Hopefully you do as well, that the information now that you provide to us will also be provided, again, anonymously to the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. Additionally, we have multiple partnerships with the Sioux Falls Development Foundation. They also look for research like this, and often that just comes from their one-on-one meetings with businesses, but they were hoping to get a broader sample size and a more regular update. And so we also will be providing your results to the Development Foundation. So hopefully you're on this list already, but if you are not, please go ahead and sign up today. Okay, with that, I think we are ready for the results. All right. So, we always begin by going big picture, and we ask our CEOs to talk to us about the business climate in Sioux Falls before we really get into how things are going at their individual businesses. And what we saw here, and this is going to be a theme today, is just a little bit of softening. So 52% at the end of September told us they felt the overall business climate in Sioux Falls was excellent. 38% said good. Now, if we rewind 3 months ago, we were at 69% excellent and 26% good. So we're still feeling positive, but I would say we're not feeling as positive as we were back 3 months ago. And if we go back to September of 2020, a year ago, we can see a really nice shift. So back in a year ago when I talked to you about this, we were at 64% good and 18% excellent. So 18% excellent a year ago has now moved to 52% excellent today. So I think that tells a good story. We then went back even further, and that's the one where you can see some 2019 data. And again, we are tracking ahead of how we were feeling about the Sioux Falls business climate in 2019. So I'll just stick with the excellence. In September of 2019, we were at a 42% excellent, and today we're at a 52. So we're not feeling quite as good as we were last quarter, but otherwise I would say we're outperforming both of those time period comparisons. And as always, we also ask about the U.S. business climate. And as always, people are not feeling quite as good about the overall national economy as they are about things here in Sioux Falls. So starting again with the most current results, September of 2021, majority still did say good. Also, that is softer than 3 months ago. So I was at 9% excellent and 48% good in the third quarter. And at the end of the second quarter, 8% excellent and 60% good. So what we've seen is a little bit of shifting from people who felt things were good nationally 3 months ago to maybe more people feeling they are just fair. Today, again, improved, no surprise, year over the third quarter of 2020. And when we look back at the same time period in 2019, I think we have also seen a bit of a decline in the perception. Just to remind you, 48% said nationally they felt that the business climate was good today. 48%, 2 years ago, that was 69%. So there is still a noticeable gap when you look back that far. Then we do move into talking about conditions overall at your business. And again, I think things were really favorable, very comparable actually, when we asked the CEOs about their individual businesses to 3 months ago. So the majority, 55%, said overall conditions are good. That was for 56% 3 months ago. Currently, 41% are at excellent. 44% were at excellent 3 months ago. We picked up a few who said that things are fair. And if we were to look back a year ago when we were having this conversation, we were at 26% fair, and we actually had 6% a year ago saying things were poor. So we have seen a noticeable year-over-year improvement. Incidentally, I did provide these to the Minneapolis Fed already, and the analyst got back to me with some quick initial thoughts just today. Said they are very comparable to what they are experiencing and hearing from other businesses there. Again, that slight softening throughout the year. I think a lot of the themes that have already been touched on today are at play here, and probably ones that we will talk about in the panel discussion, but just a lot more reasons for businesses to maybe be experiencing some challenges today that weren't quite as acute earlier this year, as well as some additional unknown factors. So I thought that was interesting to get back right away. We then also ask about business activity expectations. So where do you feel things are going in your business for the coming quarter? So again, this is the CEOs looking at the fourth quarter of this year. And 55% told us they expect above average business activity, 38% thought at least average, and 6% were not sure. Again, that shows a little bit of a softening from 3 months ago when 2/3 were going above average compared to 55%. 33% were going average, and no one was unsure 3 months ago. Hiring is an interesting one to me. I'm not totally sure this captures the entire story, but we asked about expectations for the coming 3 months, and I think, you know, there's a difference between wanting to hire and being able to hire, right? So we'll probably talk a little more about what's being experienced there. But at least average hiring to above average hiring is what the CEOs were reporting. 38% or 36%, excuse me, saying they expect above average hiring, 50% average, 2% below, and 3% were not sure. 3 months prior, we were at nearly half above average and 44% average, and a lot less uncertainty, only 3% who were unsure. Could be some seasonality at play there for sure. At the end of the year, maybe not quite as much hiring occurring anyway, but that's what the CEOs told us there. When we look at what things look like on the ground today from an employment standpoint, 39% told us that they had seen a slight increase in hiring in the past quarter, 38% no change. 17% had actually experienced a significant increase in hiring, so they're finding people somewhere, I suppose. 3% a significant decrease, 3% said it was not applicable. So if we rewind 3 months from there, 52% had reported a slight increase. 19% were at no change, and 19% reported a significant increase. So we actually had more robust hiring occurring in the second quarter than in the third quarter. And finally, we asked about capital expenditures and those expectations for the coming quarter. Again, probably a little seasonality at play there, but 55% told us they expected at least average capital expenditures, 28% above average, 13% unsure, and 5% below average. And if we looked back at the second quarter, 56% average, so very, very similar there, and 40% above average, and again, less uncertainty at 2%. So that is a high-level view of those results. We are going to be talking to some people to get their reactions to that throughout the week. If you have any thoughts as far as how they compare to your business, please feel free to email me. Hopefully most of you know how to reach me. If you do receive our email newsletters, hopefully you do. When those arrive, you can always just click on reply, and those thoughts will go right to me. But watch for that story to be coming out on Monday is the plan. So with that, I would like to move into the panel discussion. And panelists, I have not actually talked with you yet today, so if you can make your way to the stage, I'd like you to sit in alphabetical order if you wouldn't mind. So I'm sitting here next to me, Bill Allen, next to him, Ben Arndt, Jay Bender, and Luke Minion. And as you make your way to the stage, I hope you're all here, I will go ahead and do the introductions. You also, everyone will have a chance to talk with the panelists and ask your questions, so be thinking about those because I will be leaving time for that. So with that, I'm happy to introduce our panelists. We have a manufacturing focus today. I think it's going to be a terrific conversation. We're going to touch on a lot of different things that are happening in their worlds. Bill Allen is a Harrisburg native who now leads one of his community's largest employers, Showplace Cabinetry. He became president and CEO at the beginning of this year after joining the company nearly 20 years ago to manage materials and manufacturing. He leads operations in 3 Showplace manufacturing plants, which employ 675 employees, all located in South Dakota. Showplace sells to more than 800 kitchen and bath dealers who are located in all 50 states. And in 2021, Showplace moved into the top 10 largest cabinet manufacturers in the country. Ben Arndt is Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of Bell Incorporated. Family-owned business, Bell Incorporated is one of the 10 largest independently owned folding carton companies in the country, the world's largest supplier of paperboard envelopes, and it provides packaging services to some of the world's largest food manufacturers. Bell Incorporated has headquarters, 2 plants and distribution based here in Sioux Falls, and another plant and distribution in Groveport, Ohio. Jay Bender is the CEO of Falcon Plastics. Falcon Plastics is a third-generation family-owned business headquartered in Brookings with facilities across the U.S. and abroad. Falcon Plastics provides mid to high volume injection and blow molding, along with finished good assembly, tool design and building, rapid prototyping, and engineering. Yeah, that's my seat. Thank you. And finally, Dr. Luke Minion is CEO of Pipestone Holdings, chairman of the board for Holstone Farms, and chairman of the board of Riverstone. He grew up in southwest Minnesota, began his career with the Pipestone Veterinary Services in 2000 after graduating from the University of Minnesota's College of Veterinary Medicine. His areas of interest include production, animal medicine, and management. And we timed that out well, didn't we? Everybody's mic'd up and ready to go. Thanks. Please help me welcome our panelists. And handheld, there we go. Are we good? I think. Maybe. How's this? Yeah? We're good. All right. Thanks for joining me, everyone. Like I said, I've really been looking forward to the conversation. There's a lot to discuss. So, some of you, I think, we've talked before, most of you, I'm familiar with your businesses, but I always like to begin my conversation with business leaders today, especially if I haven't caught up in a while, by just asking about the state of things, because time moves so quickly, and the last year and a half has brought such rapid change. So catch me up. I'm going to start, first of all, Bill, we have not talked yet, so congratulations on your new role and the growth of Showplace. I was excited to hear about that as I put your introduction together. How are things going there today? Take me through what's new.
Can everybody hear me, first of all? Showplace is busy. The last couple of years have been kind of a wild ride for Showplace. The COVID year was presented a lot of challenges. I'm sure that all the panelists are going to tell you the same thing. But throughout that, we were able to maintain our employment, and the company has had 2 very prosperous years. So listen to the professor. We are definitely on the demand side of things in the housing industry. The building products group is booming. We are also facing our share of challenges with the supply chain and with employment. But I got to be a little careful in saying that it's too doom and gloom when we're having record years. So Showplace is thriving today. We're in the middle of a building expansion that will go online here in November. And we're hiring today, and we're producing more cabinets in units and dollars than we've ever produced. So I think things are pretty good for Showplace.
I always get story ideas from this, everybody. So I have a mental note, building expansion at Showplace. So I'll be bothering you after this about that. Supply chain and workforce, those are the themes. So we're going to get into more detail with both of those. And I feel like whenever I talk to Ben Art, we talk about workforce. I don't care what else is going on in the world. But the company continuing to grow. How are things going at Bell? What has the pandemic year and a half been like for you?
I'd second what Bill said. We've been busy. It's except for a momentary blip of right past COVID when things dipped down. We're very busy. We serve 3 main segments really: packaged food, so think cereal and crackers and pasta, things like that. Frozen foods. We serve overnight letter envelopes. And also quick serve food. So McDonald's, Happy Meals, French fries, McNuggets, things like that. So all of those businesses right after the pandemic took off, just pantry stocking, all other restaurants closing except McDonald's, the mail order businesses, all of those things took off. So all of our customers shot up. We were as busy as we've ever been, fortunate and lucky to keep our employees safe and working throughout the pandemic. We also we're just now experiencing, I say just now, in probably the past 9 months, we always have labor shortages, like you said. We're always short people. It's amplified now, obviously. We're probably just now getting to about 90% employment, which is good, I think, for others in our industry. But the other factors, obviously, paperboard is our main raw material. And because of the increase in all of the demand and the changes in consumer habits, eating at home, there was a shortage in the paperboard. Prices have spiked, and so now there's a crunch where all of our raw materials are up, and we're operating at capacity. So now the trick for us is basically to continue to pass on those price increases to our customers, which is always tricky because you're doing it out of contract. But that's where we are. It's kind of one of those times where you're really busy. You're as busy as you've ever wanted to be, but there's definitely some pain with it too.
I mean, that's the new four-letter word, is busy. Anyone I ask, it's just such a theme. But whoever put this panel together, great job, because we've got the one who builds the kitchens and the one who helps stock the food that's going to go in there. These are both very good places to be in a pandemic, so I'm not surprised. Jay Bender at Falcon, you were on this panel last year, weren't you? I thought so. So great. I wanted to pick up where we left off then and talk about what has changed since then.
Yeah, so I think we navigated through the pandemic pretty well. We slowed down a little bit that second quarter last year, probably like everybody did, just because of the shock factor, I think. But since then, things have come back pretty strong. And actually, our business so far this year through August is up 17% over last year. And we set a sales record in August, and then we broke it again last month. So we're busy, no doubt about it. All of our input costs are up. We've been able, for the most part, to be able to get the raw materials, but it's really been an effort on our part and a lot of planning. We're giving visibility out to our suppliers probably about 12 months. We've got orders out as far as 6 months out. Never have had to do that in the past, ever. And so we've been fortunate to be able to, for the most part, get to our customers what we want. We're still late on some shipments, but I would say primarily late due to lack of labor. Labor has been a huge issue for us. It continues to be an issue. We're in Brookings. Well, that's where our headquarters is, but we have plants throughout the U.S., and we're having similar problems in all of those plants. Probably Madison, South Dakota is our toughest one right now to fill some of those positions. But we're doing the best we can. Our Madison plant, actually, when they set a record in August, their labor content was down. And I asked the plant manager the question, are you just really efficient? Because we're automating as much as we possibly can. And he said, no, I just am short direct labor, so everybody in the office is out making product, which sounds cool, but nobody's doing their day job. So it really makes it hard when we're introducing new products. And the other interesting part about our business is our customer base is very diverse. And so when the pandemic hit, we saw some product lines go up, and we saw others just drop off to nothing. And so overall, we still got hurt a little bit, but the ones that are doing well, home improvement, anything outdoors is a good business to be in right now. So, but things are looking good, and they're looking good for next year too. We're expecting to probably see maybe 25 to 30% increase in business next year if we can get the product out the door.
Well, congratulations on the record. You anticipated my follow-up, which was what industries are driving it, because you do such diverse manufacturing. But great to hear. Okay, Dr. Luke Minion, I feel like we know each other. We've never actually met in person. We're Zoom buddies, right? That's a new thing. We have talked multiple times as we helped announce his project, which I'm sure you're familiar with, the Holstone Foods pork processing facility planned for Northeast Sioux Falls. We're going to talk about that, but I'm sure he will fill you in on their operation in Nebraska as well. So maybe let's begin with a little bit about who Holstone is. Take the opportunity to introduce yourself to the CEO community here, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, thank you. Not sure this is, okay, thank you. And thanks, Jody and Reggie, for the invitation. And thank you, Sioux Falls, for the warm welcome we've had on behalf of Holstone Farms. And I sincerely mean that. I live here in Sioux Falls. I've lived here for 16 years with my family. And yeah, we've announced a project that hopefully most of you are aware of. Holstone's owned by 220 farmers. They raise pigs. 75 of those 200 would be active participants in the Sioux Falls community. So many of them live in South Dakota, Minnesota, and Iowa. So we're really excited to be able to do this project here. We've had great support from the Development Foundation, the Chamber, and many of you. So again, I just want to say thanks for all that. Just a small touch on the background, I think, and then I'll get it out of the way. I serve two functions. One is the CEO and chairman of a company called Pipestone. We're a service company. We provide services to farmers. Our mission is to help farmers. We're 80 years old. We're located in Pipestone, Minnesota. We serve about 1,000 farmers. Those 1,000 farmers basically raise pigs, corn, and soybeans. Those farmers in 2016 came together to try to move up the chain towards the consumer on pork. That's the project Holstone Farms. Holstone was founded by our company Pipestone, and those producers own a packing plant in Fremont, Nebraska that we purchased from Hormel Foods in 2018. So we operate a packing plant in Fremont. We've done that now for just under 3 years. We have 1,400 people on our team at the packing plant. We have 1,400 people in our service business, Pipestone. So collectively, when we talk about facing the supply and demand issues, we're in the pig farming business, we're in the pork business, and collectively, those 1,000 farmers that I would represent here today would be the 3rd largest in the United States, 7th largest in the world. So that's the state of things in our shop. And relative to a year ago, we were worried about burying market hogs because of the interruption in the supply chain. Raise your hand if you heard about that. That was pretty tough on the farm. Thanks you for eating bacon, because truly it was pretty sobering thought as a veterinarian. We had to euthanize market animals and bury them. And this year, if there's something we're worried about, it's African swine fever. Raise your hand if you heard of that one. Okay, there's 4 of you. Thank you. No, I'm teasing. But we are really uptight about the United States getting a foreign animal disease, African swine fever. Would devastate our industry. So thanks for the opportunity.
Luke, and then work my way back because our next question's on supply chain, and it's a bit different in your world than it is in their world. But the disruptions to the supply chain are just incredible to me. You know, it almost doesn't matter what business or what industry you're in. It's not just a manufacturing problem. It's certainly a retail problem. It's probably a healthcare problem. I haven't talked to you about that either. But essentially, if your business relies on a container to get anything here, good luck. And there are many, many other challenges within the supply chain as well. So, but let's begin on the Holstone side of things, Pipestone side of things, because your supply chain is just different. But what does that look like today? And maybe what do you anticipate that looks like as you move toward the Sioux Falls plant? I realize that is quite a ways into the future, but your ability to get the supply that you need here might be worth touching on too.
On the construction side, these are large projects, so we're still completing the construction at the plant in Fremont. It was a little over $400 million project, and like everyone here, we have difficulty getting simple things. So we faced some issues there. We're going to be behind schedule a bit, but probably 5% over what we thought we'd spend and 6 months behind. And then in Sioux Falls, we're too early to really gauge how far out we're going to have to order. But some of the key equipment that we order, we have 14-month lead times, which again, to put that in perspective, those were 6 months before the pandemic. So yeah, and then that's the construction side. The pig supply is an important part of the element, and for many of you, we're grateful to be harvesting right now. The farmers, it's a pretty dry year, right? So we're all on edge about the availability of corn, and so corn, in the end, looks like we're going to have enough to feed the pigs. And the note, though, however, is there is inflation, or whatever we want to call it. There's input cost challenges all along the chain in pork and in protein. So whether that's corn or soybeans or steel, picket, everything we buy and touch right now is more expensive than it's been in quite a while.
Okay, I'll go back to Jay, who probably sees multiple supply chain issues as well. Talk to me a little bit about what you're experiencing, and then also as you're having to get product to your customers. I'm sure the trucking industry is going to play into that, and other transportation. What has that been like trying to navigate?
Yeah, the supply chain's still pretty messed up. like I said, we've been able to get what we need for the most part, but it's been through painstaking efforts and giving visibility way out to our suppliers. But there's still, what I'm seeing now is because the container ships are so plugged up, we're starting to see people actually bring things in from overseas by air. And the cost is a lot more, but I think a lot of factories are faced with the decision of, do I pay more for my input or do I shut my factory down when demand's high? It's a pretty easy answer to that, in my opinion. And what happens is, and that's why I asked the question about inflation, what's happening is these costs are getting passed through the system. You know, our suppliers tell us, here's how much it's going to be now. And if we say no, they say, that's no problem. There's 4 other people that want that material we got earmarked for you. We'll just ship it to them. And so then the answer becomes, okay, yeah, we'll take the price increase. And that goes from them to us to our clients. And I'm assuming it's getting pushed through to consumer. I mean, that's usually what happens. So it does impact our margins. It's always better when our input prices are going down because there is always a lag on how quickly you can pass that either savings or cost increase on. So when the prices are going up, we're always playing catch up on that. And it does hurt your margins a little bit as you're going. And business doesn't like volatility. We don't like uncertainty. There's plenty of that right now. So even though, like Bill said, we're having a record year, things are great, I should be just super happy, and I am. But this uncertainty of what the future is going to bring puts a damper on it, which I don't like, but that's the reality of the situation. So
today about businesses starting to fly materials in, and then I talked to someone else today who needs to get lawnmowers over here. Well, you can't exactly stick them on a plane. So, and yet there's not a lot you can do other than wait for the container in some cases. Ben, what about your world? What does that look like?
Yeah, very, very similar to what Jay said. We have a few raw materials. We have the paperboard that has to go in there. We have ink to print it, glue, corrugated, things like that. All of those things due to, one, the demand spikes, the supply chain issues because of whether it's COVID, whether it's the weather issues that impacted like the glue and adhesive and ink markets from the refineries going down in Texas. One of our mill systems had a cyber attack. So all of these things led to just record price increases over the last 9 months, likes of which we've never seen before in every raw material that we've had. So it's chasing those price increases, trying to pass them on. And the same thing, we're on, most people that are buying paperboard are on allocation now. So it is a matter of if you pay this today, we'll just give it to somebody else, we'll sell it to somebody else. That's easy enough. So to serve our customers, we're going to continue to pay those prices and get what we need. There are people in our industry smaller than us, unfortunately, that actually aren't getting the paperboard that they need to service their customers. So that's introduced a lot of different dynamics in our industry where now you have people coming to us. You have other large converters that are weeding out their bottom quadrant of margin business because they're gonna serve the most profitable customers first, and the other ones go away. Well, there are now customers in the market, whether it's food packaging companies or whoever, that aren't getting packaging. So if they're lucky enough to get corn or lucky enough to get food products or whatever else, they now can't get packaging. So that's why you see empty shelves in the stores. That's why there's such a change there. But it's impacted everything. Same, if a machine goes down, the parts that we need are typically in Germany. It used to be a pretty easy FedEx trip, overnight air. Now it's, sometimes the part takes 7 days. And we're used to getting it in 24 hours. We can't have a machine down more than, I don't want a machine down for a few minutes, let alone hours or days or weeks, same thing. So it's impacted all those things. And of course, those factories that make the printing presses, the factories that make the die cutters, they don't have enough labor, they don't have enough service technicians. So it is absolutely just, it's hit everything. So it's an interesting time to navigate through the challenge.
Is there any relief in sight, or is it too hard to tell?
I think from a paperboard side, we anticipate forecast probably through 2023. The prices could continue to go up, and then they will start to plateau. It's a bit of an oligopoly mill system where they've worked hard to cap the amount of paperboard that's produced domestically. So they like it this way because the prices are now at a level where they like them. The capacity is limited. One of them is about to start up a very large paper mill, and when they start up that very large paper mill, they will shut down the exact amount of tons in other less efficient mills to keep it where it is. So it's tricky. I don't see it getting back to where it was a year ago, maybe ever. And I think it'll at least be a year until it stabilizes somewhat.
Well, it's interesting because you think about grocery prices going up, right? It's easy to
They
just
will.
point to food costs and labor and all that, but packaging, it's one of those things you just don't think about, and
Yep.
yet I'm sure it's factored in. Right?
Of course,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, supply chain. Bill, an interesting conversation in your industry as well. I've talked to many home builders recently who, they have to come back with the closet door about 2 months after closing.
Because they don't have their cabinets.
I didn't hear a lot about the cabinets, but I did about the doors, and I'm hearing millwork too is starting to be challenging. But yeah, what are you experiencing?
So building products. Anyone in the audience that's building a house or doing a remodel job knows this situation as far as supply chain challenges. I came out of the supply chain side of the business and have worked in the supply chain for over 30 years. And I think what we're seeing now is the complexity of the supply chain and how many different products are interlinked. When you talk about shortages of resins and finished products, adhesives, and how they affect all of those supply chains. And all of them are feeling pressures this time at price and availability. In our world, forever, we heard about softwood lumber prices and how the cost of price of a lumber package in a home had went up $24,000 or $35,000. Most of the woods that we use are hardwoods. But what we were into a situation, particularly in panel products, plywoods, particle boards, MDF, which is what a large part of your kitchen cabinets are made out of, was a competition in those markets, in those mills, for press time. They wanted to make CDX, exterior grade plywood, to build homes. So again, when you look at the complexity of the supply chain and you don't realize that one thing is affecting another, and you amplify that by steel, hardware, paint, throw in a few things like what happened in Texas with the freeze and the impact it had on plastics and things like that. We have been forced to take 3 price increases this year, and the first time in the history of our company.
3 price increases.
Correct. We've never taken 2. So it is a dramatic change in operations for us when it comes to supply chain. It has limited, we've had to curtail some production capacity. It's a combination of labor shortages and material shortages, but our backlog is higher than it has ever been. We are sitting on a backlog of 50,000 cabinets right now, and part of that is due to inability to get building products sourced and delivered. About 90% of what we use in kitchen cabinets, we source domestically, and I would say we're somewhat unique there, but we set our supply chain that way, and we've stuck to it. So the container shortage doesn't affect us as dramatically as some other industries, but it's still a factor. We do use some import plywood to supplement those panels, and those are difficult to get. But we've had wood costs that have gone up anywhere from 15 to 40% this year. Our finished costs are up 15 to 20%, and panel products the same. So those prices in the housing market driven by products like cabinets, appliances, millwork, and doors are real factors. I was listening very keenly when we talked, when the professor was talking about, will this back off? Some of those markets are commodity-driven markets, the lumber price, and we index lumber, so I feel those will. Some of the others I'm a little more concerned about. I think there's more stability in those markets at a higher level, and the demand is so great that it's hard to see unless there is something from that demand side, a shock, which nobody wants to see, that forces that market to go down. But supply chain is a very true day-to-day struggle in our company.
I listen to all of you guys talk, and I think cost of living, right? I mean, these are basic food and housing that down the line are going to have some real impacts on cost of living. I do want to switch gears a bit now and talk workforce because there's a lot to talk about there, and I will stick with you, Bill, on this. 650 employees, if I remember right, thereabout?
If we could hire everybody we needed, we'd be close to 700, yeah. We bounce around between 650 and 675.
So what does the current situation look like? And I would really like our audience here to come away with at least a little bit from a strategy standpoint about maybe what you've tried and what might have been successful for you, or what you're going to be trying.
Hiring people in the Sioux Falls metro area is a very difficult thing to do right now. We have been hiring nonstop for the last 15 to 18 months. We put on an abnormally high number of seasonal workers, college and high school workers. We put on about 25 of those this season, which is probably double or triple what we usually hire. And when they all went back to school in August, it's been very difficult to replace them. We have probably spent more money in workforce retention and trying to attract people to apply at Showplace this year than in the 20 years that we've been in business. And we have really gotten creative. Our marketing director's in the audience today, and she talks about brand awareness for workplace retention purposes. You know, and when you're marketing, people are just as involved with hiring and retaining employees as they are in selling your product. That's a change in the dynamic in how we look at businesses. And it's been a very competitive marketplace. We raise our wages across the board 6 years in a row to be competitive. Last year we went up over $1.50 an hour. And it becomes a question of how high can you go to attract and retain employees and still remain competitive in the marketplace. So we've attacked it from just about every angle, and that is social media and trying to attract people in different ways. We've attracted from the wage side. We now have a 2-week new hire training program. We immediately put people with mentors on the floor to try to introduce them to our workplace in a way to keep them. But the biggest problem is retaining those employees. We can attract a fair amount application-wise. The number of people who actually show up for the interview is about half of those that apply. Than the ones that we hire. We have to hire 5 to keep 1. The number one issue is attendance, and showing up for work on time is very difficult. And in the manufacturing environment, that's something you have to have. I was interested in your article about the gig economy, and you talked to a young lady that was in the manufacturing environment. And that works against us. It's a little bit difficult because we have a structured environment.
You can't gigify your manufacturing.
I can't gigify my manufacturing. I've been trying to figure out how to do that, but I haven't figured it out. If any of you guys got it figured out, I would like to know.
When the line is running, someone has to be there or automate, right? I mean, possible.
Daycare is important, so changes in schedule, the amount of overtime I need them to work is very important. Work-life balance is a big catchphrase that we work on in our manufacturing. So I'm going to let some of these other guys talk about it, but I think you can tell that hiring and retaining employees is a big challenge for us.
Despite doing, frankly, it sounds like a lot of things right. So yeah, thank you. Okay, I was going to say this is always the conversation that I have with you, Ben. I have to think it's probably more challenging than ever, but you've tried a lot of strategies over the years.
Yeah, everything that Bill said, agree. So I'm not going to repeat those things. We've tried all of the same things, the same ratios, the same tactics. And I would say, I mean, operating in Sioux Falls or in South Dakota for as long as we have, we were practicing for this. I mean, we were ready for this moment when the labor market is tight. We know how to attract talent, recruit them, retaining, and it's just the issues have now just been amplified from where they were, say, a year ago. I think the main changes are so we're competing now more with flexibility. More people want a flexible job more than ever before. They had this taste of being at home or being out of the workforce or taking care of their kids or being closer to their family for a while, and that meant something. So they're looking. So we're experimenting where we can. It's hard in manufacturing, like you said, with more flexible work schedules, or 6 hours while the kids are at school, 8-hour shifts, 10-hour shifts, but whatever it is, weekend shifts, taking the hours when the people will give them to us. We're obviously I mean, I wish I raised wages once a year. I'm raising them once a month. It seems like it's the lever that we have for the entry level that we have to use, because after years of this practice, we know that wage is the one thing that is going to get them from somewhere else. There are not a lot of unemployed people out there. I have to steal them from one of these guys. Right. I mean, that's literally what you have to do, and you have to do it for another 50 cents an hour, another $1 an hour. So those are the things. I think we're also, as manufacturers, we want to make sure we're kind of extolling the virtues of manufacturing to people coming up and giving manufacturing more meaning, because now that people have been through the pandemic, if they're going to work, if they're going to be away from their families, or they're not going to be home taking care of their kids, they want to do something that's more meaningful. So we've seen a little difference in our Ohio facility, where we have about 100 people, and our main labor competitor there is just distribution centers or giant Amazon warehouses. All the mail order places in the country are there, but the people are making something in our plant, and that means something to them. They're not just moving boxes back and forth. They can go see their product in any grocery store in the country. So it's trying to find those nuggets that make the work meaningful, offer some flexibility, raise the wage level, the benefits lever, whatever it is. It's a combination of all those things all the time, and we're still, 20 to 30 people short all the time.
Okay, Jay, you get to hire in Brookings, so using a smaller population base, but as you said, you've got locations in multiple areas. Are there some themes that have bubbled up for you, and maybe how do things compare here versus some of your other locations?
We've got plants in Brookings, Madison, South Dakota, Lexington, Tennessee, and Portland, Oregon, as well as a facility in China. We're seeing the same thing. I won't speak to China, but seeing the same thing in the U.S. At all of our facilities. The Portland facility is a little bit easier just because we're a small fish in a big pond, and there's just more people that you have a chance at least to maybe get some applicant flow. But in South Dakota and even in Tennessee, we've had to raise wages just to get applicant flow. And, we already have profit sharing. We have for decades. We've got a very strong benefit package. And we're trying to do a lot of the same things that these gentlemen have talked about. One of the other things that we're doing, and this is not a short-term fix, but we're trying to bring people, especially students, through our facilities. I think manufacturing's done a really poor job over the decades of not marketing who we are and what we do. People who aren't familiar with manufacturing still think it's dark, dirty, and dangerous. and it's as far from that as it can be. I mean, everybody runs strong safety programs. We're automating. You walk through our factories, there's robotics going all over the place, and that's our other way to combat the direct labor issue, which I'm guessing that a lot of what both of you were talking about was direct labor. When you get into higher level positions, engineering or supervision or management, we don't have the turnover, and it's a little bit easier to recruit from a regional or a national basis. But on direct labor, you kind of have to pull that from, a 50-mile radius, and if every other manufacturer in that 50-mile radius is doing well and hiring, then you see what's happening in Brookings. It's just a spiral of wage. It's just a wage competition because you have to steal them from somebody else, then they raise their wage and steal them back, and then you raise yours and steal them back. It's really good for the employee. It's kind of nice, but it's hard on the business, and turnover's hard. And the other challenge that we have is we run 24 hours a day. And so it's not so bad on our day shift. People, for whatever reason, don't mind working during the day so much. But when you ask somebody to work, from 4 to midnight or midnight till 8 in the morning, that's tougher. That's unusual. That doesn't maybe fit with your family life or your, the lifestyle that you're looking for. And so that's where we've seen more turnover, or we've seen it more difficult to get that flow and get people into those positions. Even though we pay premiums for working on those shifts, just a little bit tougher. So we try to get people in, and we're doing some other creative things with some other, working maybe with disabled people and getting them into positions that they can be productive. There's a group in Brookings called Teen Challenge. It's kind of a reentry program for young men, and they come in and help us with certain things. We've had some high school, the interns or kind of work study things. That's been great, but again, when summer's over, they're gone. And, so that's a challenge. So, but we're seeing the same thing across all of our plants. It's not just a South Dakota phenomenon. This is happening everywhere in the U.S.
I saw Luke nodding when you talked about the challenge of overnight work, something that they're familiar with in their industry. I know the plan in Sioux Falls, and again, we're talking 2025 here if everything stays on track, is to start with a day shift. But you're dealing with this in Nebraska. You're preparing, of course, to staff up in Sioux Falls, assuming it all comes together. What kind of strategies does Holstone use?
Yes. So, not going to repeat all the comments. I think helpful to make sure I explain kind of where we come from. We've been staffing pig farms, for 30 years, and they're in remote locations like Willow Lake, South Dakota, and Corsica, South Dakota, and we need, 15 to 20 people to work in those locations. So the short answer for us has been, after we do all of the things that we are all trying to do, we have an office in Mexico. We've operated it there for 5 years. We have an office in China. And we recruit through a TN visa program out of our office in Mexico. And if we did not have that today, we simply could not staff the remote located sow farms, nor could we staff our packing plant, no matter the wage we pay. It's not about wages. At some point, it's about people willing to do the work. So I would echo the remarks that maybe all of us need to be somehow, I know I am, just grateful for manufacturing. And reward those people and recognize them in society. They're pretty darn important to what we all consume. So I guess the point I'm getting at is today, in the 1,400 people that we work with at Pipestone, there's about a third of those that are legally recruited from Mexico, college grads, that we rent apartments for them, we furnish those apartments for them, and we provide them transport. And if we didn't do that, we couldn't staff our farms. So as we look to staff Holstone, and I'm super, committed here, it's my hometown, we're going to have to do some things that are going to look different probably, but it's going to have to include a lot of the things I just said, which means all those issues that come with it. The language issues, the school issues, they don't fall on deaf ears, but I think if you go to Fremont and you go to neighborhoods in South Dakota that we've already been doing these things, It's just a matter of survival. If we don't approach the issue with something unique, we cannot staff these functions. And we're not unique to the industry. So for us, it's about getting out the purse, if you will, spending the money, and establishing a culture that people want to come from Mexico, which in this case is just one example. They come here, they love these jobs. They can separate their family for a generation with these jobs, and they're highly educated, highly quality people. That's going to have to be part of our recipe.
And you led right into my next question, which is, workforce is about more than a job, and there are these elements of community that are required, whether it's accessible housing, transportation, or ongoing education. How should we as a community go about addressing those? And I'll stick with you, Luke, because it's obviously a top of mind question that comes up when I get asked about your project, and I know it's something that your company is hoping to work with the community on, but what does that look like?
Well, I think it starts with sort of this set of remarks I just made. There's a lot of terrific people from all over the world that want to come here and work in the jobs that all of us represent. And at least in my view, that makes for a pretty darn diverse and exciting place to live too. So for me, done right, it's great. Done wrong, it's a disaster. So for our role in it, we need to make sure that the folks that we're bringing, in this case I'm using Mexico, but in this case if we're bringing those folks from Mexico, our job as the employer is to make sure that they have the things they're going to need to acculturate, that we can locate them housing, we can arrange for the things I just talked about. We help them open their first checking account. We help them get furniture. We need to do those things, and when you do those things, those people are, in our experience, hundreds of them now, not 10, hundreds of them over years, you're going to love them in your hometown. They're outstanding. But if you don't do those steps, they get lost. And it's not necessarily their issue. It's kind of on the groups like us that bring them here to try to help them acculturate and fit in and have a place that we can, help them with their language skills, help them with their kids, so on and so forth. So from my standpoint, we can't be all of those things, but we're going to do our part for the role we have to play here in Sioux Falls.
Jay, what do you think? Are there some things that the community could be doing to be a more workforce-friendly place?
Yeah, I think the big issue, and I didn't mention it earlier, you mentioned it a little bit, but with all the businesses going well and all the employment opportunities, all of us would hire more people if they were available. The only way that's going to happen is if we get people to come here, whether they're from Mexico or from Minnesota. They need to come here. They're not going to come here if they don't have a place that they can afford to live in. So housing is, in my opinion, especially in South Dakota, and I see this really bad here compared to our plant in Tennessee, where people can buy a house for $100,000 still down there, okay? A decent house. Brookings, I believe the average selling price for a house last year was $284,000. I don't think I can pay very many people enough money to afford that house. And so how do you get people to move to your community if you have that big of a barrier? And I don't think Sioux Falls is that much different than Brookings is or many other places in South Dakota. So our property taxes are extremely high compared to other states. There's a lack of housing, and there's a lack of housing in even the small communities around some of these towns like Brookings or Sioux Falls. Those are being bought up. So I can try to recruit people to come to my, come and work for us, but if there's not a place for them to live, they're not coming. And so I know the legislature's talking about, I think they want to call it workforce housing instead of affordable housing. I don't really care what you call it. We need to figure out some solutions on that, and part of that can be the local communities and their zoning, what they allow, they don't allow, and Brookings is very restrictive on that, and that's just helping communities like Aurora and Volga. Aurora, I think, has grown, they're probably 3 times the size they were 10 years ago. Of course, when you're starting with 300, maybe that's not a lot, but still, the growth there in that community is tremendous, and that's because some people, well, one of them was Al Kurtenbach, really went out and tried to do some things to help make that happen, and we just need more of that. I don't know much about developing, so I'm a bad person to probably get advice from on this, but I can see what the problem is, and the solution is to try to have something that is more affordable for people to be able to come here. Otherwise, it's going to be really difficult to grow the population of the state. And if we don't have the workers, we can automate a lot. I still need people, though.
Ben, what do you think?
Yeah, I second on the affordable housing piece is a big one. I would also just add that childcare is a big hole right now. There's way too much, like the professor said, one-on-one childcare. You don't have the economies of scale where the caregiver at home can also work nearly as often, and that's a big hole I think we have. So the housing, the more child care options for these people, and then I would also just say, I think embrace the diversity. Our company would not be where it is without the refugees that have come to Sioux Falls, whether it was the ones from Eastern Europe a few decades ago, from Africa today, wherever they come from tomorrow. We need those populations to come here and support our growing businesses. They're not taking jobs from anybody. I think you have at least 4 people up here. They're saying if anybody, somebody that needs a job and doesn't have one now, they can talk to us after this. But it's those people are incredibly important, and whether they come from another state or another country, we need to embrace that, welcome them, have the systems here to support them. LSS has always been a big help for us in teaching English when they come in here, teaching them some life skills, giving them the connections they need to get a job and then thrive. And we need a lot more of that.
One thing that was not mentioned, Bill, was public transportation. Is that an issue in Harrisburg at all, or any other community-based issues that you see?
That just came up in discussions. Some other employer was providing transportation, and we haven't thought of that. Actually, we've thought about it and discussed it. Harrisburg's not a long way away, but for some people, that's an impediment of working in a community, even if you have to drive 10 miles. If you don't have a car, if the car isn't reliable, that's a problem. So I think it is something we will explore in the future. And I would echo everything that was just said here. Daycare, if you watch the HBA numbers, the number of multi-unit homes going, or apartment complexes and things going into the city of Sioux Falls, you realtors, bankers, I know you watch those numbers like a hawk. Everybody talks about single-family homes. Look at the multi-home numbers. They're 4 times what they have been in prior years. So Sioux Falls is trying to respond. I don't know what the cost of all those apartments are, but it has to be addressed that way. A full 25% of our workforce population is from the immigrants, and we embrace them at Showplace. Many times our managers will say they're some of our most dependable and loyal employees. So I think that's something that we all have to prepare ourselves for. You see it in the Sioux Falls Public Schools. I see the demographics in the schools. It's going to happen. So.
I do want to leave time for questions. Anyone have one that they want to make sure we get asked here? 2 microphones. I could not have possibly asked them all. Oh, sure.
This is a fantastic panel. Ben, you mentioned oligopolists in the supply chain, and Jay, you mentioned commodities and how those are flexible. I've long wondered, to what extent are these supply constraints, do you think, even outside your industry? I think of like ports and so on. These are not perfectly competitive environments. So to what extent is this sort of snag, the inability to sort of break this and get it back to where it was before, driven by concentration in that supply chain? Monopolies, oligopolies, whatever the case may be. Is it your experience that that's who dominates it?
Yeah, I can only speak to our industry, but there are certainly suppliers who have worked to reach this level of pricing power and leverage, and it's the pandemic has just accelerated that path to where they wanted to get to, and that's what their shareholders demand of them. So they're in a happy place. I think we're also seeing, people taking advantage, right? Suppliers that have maybe no raw material factors going up for them or no shortages or anything else, but hey, everybody's raising prices, let's raise prices, you know, that, and they're taking advantage of that, or they're raising them further than what the raw materials support. So yeah, I think for those companies or industries that were trying to reach this point of controlling the capacity, mill capacity, they've hit it sooner than they anticipated, and like I said, I don't think they have an interest in going back. Yeah.
In the pork supply chain, that's the reason we need a packing plant in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, owned by farmers, because without it, we can't share in the chain at all, because there is a concentration of that stage of the supply. And the pandemic accelerated it even worse.
Directly answer your question, but one of the things that we're seeing, and I think one of the reasons why we've been winning work over the last year, is all of these issues with the supply chain, and it's so bottlenecked up. There's a lot of businesses that do source all over the world or in a lot of different places, and they are scrutinizing their supply chains heavily. They don't want to have this, be in this situation again if they can help it. And so they're looking at what can we do to de-risk our supply chain. So the old just-in-time model that manufacturers, we worked hard to get there. To control our, you know, having low inventories is great because it frees up cash. But you're seeing kind of I don't want to say a revolt, but maybe a little bit of an opposite of that, where it's like, look, if I can get this material and I know I'm going to use it, I'm bringing it in. As long as I got the cash, I'm bringing it in. And so I think it actually exacerbates the problem a little bit, that we're carrying more inventory than we normally would. And I think a lot of manufacturers are, because if I can get it, I'm taking it, because I know I'm going to sell it. And the only risk I'm really taking is how much did I pay for it? And is the price going to be lower tomorrow? Right now, I don't think many of us are feeling that there's very much that's going to be less tomorrow than it is today. So why not bring it in if I can get it? And then trying to get your suppliers a little bit closer to home, closer to where you need them to deliver the product. And so we've had customers move product from Mexico to us, and then they're moving stuff from China to Mexico. We have another customer that's just been bringing us work that's for some of their factories that are closer to where we're at. Our business tends to be backyard. The closer we can be to our customer, the better. But on the supply side, since we're buying commodities, plastics, that's a worldwide market, and so it's really tough. And the storm, you know, all of the COVID and all of everything else plugging things up was really bad. And then the storm that hit Texas last February, that was devastating to our industry. Some of those factories that produced the plastic pellets were shut down, or the feedstocks that they use were shut down for weeks. And those aren't facilities that you just snap your fingers and start back up again. They could take a week to get fired back up again. So the storms and the hurricanes are almost for us just as bad as the clogged up ports and the COVID pandemic. So.
Not just manufacturing that's ordering ahead, it's retail. I've talked to a number of retailers that are doing the exact same thing. If they have the warehouse space, they're bringing it in. Other questions? Okay. I do want to leave a few minutes in case you want to visit with the panelists yourselves here afterwards. So we'll take one more question.
Hi, I had a question about, there are a few you talking about labor shortages and then how some of the functions are increasing your use of automation. Just sort of curious, sort of like how quickly that's moving and whether you're seeing that actually displace and how much maybe of the labor that you would have used previously to have your same level of output, or if that's increasing.
I guess I can kick that off a little bit. Automation in our industry is increasing. We see it in our cutting department, in our finish department. We spend annually in excess of $1 million a year in automation-driven initiatives, and that number is increasing. We don't look at it as displacing labor. We look at it as an opportunity to grow capacity. Again, I told you what the backlog was, and knowing that the people problem is always going to be there, we've made a commitment to automation every year at Showplace, and we continue to do that. Someone mentioned robotics. Robotics are moving into the cabinet industry in the finish. We've used robotics in cutting and sanding for years, and those kind of investments have just, when I hear people talk about automation, it's really been going on in the cabinet industry, believe it or not, for probably over 10 years. It's still a highly manual process, but we do a great deal of automation, and it's continuing to grow.
Yeah, we do the same thing. Automating is just it's a math problem, right? So as wages go up, you say it's that robot is now worth more, and we've always looked at taking out the most difficult or most monotonous or the tasks that people don't want to do. That's what we automate first. Shocker, you can't get robots now because the lead time on robots has gone up. So that's also part of the issue. But yeah, automation is going to be a big. They will benefit from this workforce shortage and from the increased labor costs.
Yeah, so we've been automating probably for at least 30 years. We've never, ever once let anybody go due to adding automation to our factory, ever. And I don't see that happening. When employees ask about that, my response back to them is, this automation is going to eliminate a job from our competitor, not from us. Because if our competitor doesn't automate, they're not going to be competitive and they're going to lose the work. So this is a matter of survival. It's not even so much about lack of labor. It's about being competitive in a world market. And it just so happens it also can help us with that direct unskilled labor, which is what we're all struggling with right now. So I think in 1975, when my parents started the company, it was probably 2/3 to 3/4 of our workforce was direct labor, people who packed stuff, who worked with the machines. It's less than half now, probably about 1/3. But we have more engineers, we have more technicians, all those higher paying jobs that are more career. It's just a more fun job. It's just more exciting. It takes more education. It pays better, and so that's good. Our payroll's way higher than it used to be, but it's because even though we have maybe, not as many or the same amount of people, even though we've doubled or tripled or quadrupled our business, we can do it with those same number of people, and so it keeps us competitive. It makes the jobs that we have better, higher paying, and the technology that's available today in automation is amazing. The camera technology is, outstanding. We're doing 100% inspections for customers. Every single part we produce can be, not in all cases, but if you automate, you can take a picture of that part and you can show what it looked like when it was made. You can show any value added work that we did to it, exactly what we did. And so the data that we have available to us and the camera technology and just the robotics it's elevated so much. It's just incredible what you can do now. And the costs have come down a little bit as well. So and like you said, as wages go up, it's a math problem. As the wages go up, we just look at what can this do. So we have some very sophisticated automation, but we have some really simple stuff too. I like it because it doesn't cost as much.
Nothing new. We've been automating tasks within the plants for 30 years. I don't. To your question, even if we quadrupled the budget, the robots are short in supply, and the other issue is incrementally it wouldn't change our labor needs a lot because we've been at it a long time. So we can take a few of those tasks and get the best in technology in the world to continue to automate. But in reality, if our single shift needs 1,000 people, we might be able to reduce 20, not 200. So, And that just tells you that we've already automated for all these years. It's a small change relative until there's some real breakthrough engineering in our business.
I thought this was just an incredibly interesting panel. Hopefully you all did too. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and experiences so well with us. Please help me thank the panelists as well. And that does bring us to the end of the program. So again, thanks for being here. Thank you, South Dakota Chamber, for inviting me to MC once again. I do see that the bar in the back is attended, so if you would like to spend a little more time and catch up with people, we don't get as many opportunities to do that. So more food back there as well. And with that, I'll wish you a good night and hopefully see you again next year. Thanks for coming, everyone.
S C